Hi, let's talk about Ayurvedic Yoga. There are so many kinds of Ayurvedic Yoga that are often presented, and I wanted to talk about how working with me and through this method of engagement with Ayurveda and yoga is different than what's offered and also why. So the first thing I wanted to discuss is that from my education and perspective, it's not really about blending Ayurveda and yoga to balance a dosha. The reason for this is because the goals of Ayurveda are very high and the goals of yoga are very high. So sometimes when we combine them and we use asana or use pranayama to balance a dosha, it doesn't really meet the high aspirations of these two sciences. And when we reduce the goals of these sciences to something that's very mundane, even though frustrating or causing struggle temporarily, it actually reduces the potency of the practices. So, like anything, when we aim high, the simpler or more mundane experiences are going to be absolutely included in that effort, because when we aim high, everything that's below is supported. But when we aim low, we don't have the opportunity for these higher resolutions. So by practicing Ayurvedic yoga and remembering the philosophies of Ayurveda and remembering the philosophies of yoga and keeping those in the top of our mind and at the top of our goal set while we're engaging balancing dosha or guna, etc., this ends up being really beneficial. Additionally, Ayurvedic yoga can't really aim to balance a dosha, and I want to get into why. It's not just because it's kind of unlikely that one posture or sequence will actually balance a dosha in totality anyway. But the larger part is that such minute housekeeping kind of misses the larger quest of the practices, like I was just expressing. It misses the higher aim. And then we have reduced Ayurveda and yoga into something that it's not really intended to be, and eventually it won't really work. Why, though, can we not expect a posture or sequence to fully balance a dosha? This answer is multiple fold. So dosha accumulates over time. The doshas accumulate due to over or under consumption of particular qualities or gunas, or just by completely ignoring the basic tenets of harmonious living, like not eating seasonally, ignoring hunger, ignoring urges, forcing urges, over exercising, under exercising, all of these things, over fasting, things like that. So by ignoring those things and also engaging in excess intake through the senses of any of the gunas, doshas eventually become unbalanced. So first of all, doshas don't just increase on their own as an entity. Their increase is dependent upon the influence by the potential gunas that are surrounding us. And that could be through food, through activity, and just through season of the year, season of life, things like this. So they accumulate due to these intakes or ignoring the needs of the body, balanced living practices. The longer doshas linger, and or the longer ama lingers, which tends to come when dosha lingers for a long time, and the longer the digestive fire, the agni, is struggling or is not working, the protocols needed are going to need to be a lot more potent than a yoga asana sequence. Because if it's a long-standing problem, it cannot be corrected by an external means. It's going to have to be created or treated internally, because that's where the dosha is located. So doshas also are everywhere. Often Ayurvedic yoga is just aiming at the home sites of the doshas, like the belly for pitta, the upper body for kapha, the colon for vata, and the legs perhaps. But actually dosha is everywhere, because the whole body is actually made of dosha when it's balanced. And yes, the doshas tend to accumulate in those areas, but moving them around from those areas isn't necessarily going to solve the problem systemically, though it could create some temporary relief. But remember, the goals of Ayurveda and the goals of yoga are not really aiming for temporary relief. They're aiming for systemic relief so that the practitioner's awareness can go higher. So this is something that's important to keep in mind. If postures are only going after these main areas where doshas live, the practice actually kind of becomes symbolic because it's pulling us away from reality. I'm doing this forward fold to balance pitta, or because it's pitta season. But if you're not actually making true change and engaging with dosha at its point of change, which is its guna, quality, not as like a total concept in a specific location, we're not actually practicing Ayurvedic yoga. We're just using the tag to label something, which pulls us away from both the goals of Ayurveda, which is very active, karmic in nature, and the goals of yoga, which is also very active and karmic in nature. So we want to make sure we're not practicing symbolically to make us feel like we're on the path to healing, rather be on the path to healing. So, if the practice is done, the asana practice is done, is we utilize the opposite gunas of the dosha that may be present. There is more likelihood of benefit. However, like I said previously, if the issue is long-standing, a yoga sequence made of the opposite gunas would have to be practiced so regularly to have any systemic effect, because doshas accumulate over time. So an asana sequence practiced for 20 minutes to an hour a day can't really compete with all of the time of accumulation, right? It needs more support than an asana sequence can provide. So if dosha have accumulated to such a degree that there is a systemic presence of the dosha, like we're feeling the presence of the dosha through symptomatology, it means they've also likely, the doshas have moved beyond their home site. So practicing these asanas in a way that balances the dosha is not really attending to the dosha, because if pitta has spread beyond the center of the body, then forward folding is not necessarily going to do anything, or may do something harmfully. And then again, we have to think about the way we do something. So we want to make sure that our practices are really thorough and not just on or off, like kapha balancing only, so we're only running around, or vata balancing only, so we're only lying on the floor. We really have to consider the details, and the details are in the guna. Like I was saying, also, asana cannot compete with lifestyle. For asana to be effective, a person really needs to also change their lifestyle and then support it with asana. It's just never going to be enough. And we know this because if you think about how long you practice asana for, even the longest practice could be 2 hours, but there's 24 hours in the day, and how many days a week for how many months of the year, for how many years of your life are you going to practice 2 hours of asana every day? It's very challenging. So better to incorporate the practices into your lifestyle and then support with asana. However, including asana and infusing it with the awareness of the gunas, which we learn from Ayurveda, will increase the practitioner's sensitivity and awareness. This is really, really beneficial because this puts us back on the mark of interacting with the highest goals of yoga and the highest goals of Ayurveda. The highest goals of yoga are self-realization and moksha, and the highest goals of Ayurveda is like swastha or sukha, happiness, health. The thing that's cool is that when we're healthy, when we're in swastha, we're more inclined to the deeper practices of yoga, the higher practices of yoga. It'll actually, by practicing Ayurvedic yoga this way through guna, through observing how a sequence can be engaged with relative to the guna, it actually puts the practitioner on the yogic path, particularly of Patanjali's yogic path of the 8 limbs. The reason for this is because In the yogic path, it's necessary for the senses to be attended to and simplified in their use. So Ayurveda is very much about this, because what you engage with your senses, what you intake through the senses, will affect the dosha through guna. So by simplifying how we're utilizing the senses through guna, through quality, we both are engaging with Ayurveda, and we're also engaging with yoga because we're starting to practice pratyahara, the withdrawal of the senses. So by practicing Ayurvedic yoga, we're paying attention to how we do things, not necessarily only what we're doing, because it's in the how where the gunas really live. So we end up practicing pratyahara, and then we draw the senses more inwardly. We're observing how we're feeling. We're observing cause and effect of every choice we make, and then making a choice from there, which starts to move us toward dharana, this like holding of concentration in a more fixed place. And this eventually leads to dhyana, this complete absorption in the doing of the moment, because of the guna, because we had something to do that is not symbolic, but is also not external. Like externally rotate your upper arm, or step your right foot here and press through the pinky toe, right? That's external. So by engaging with guna, like press your right pinky toe into the floor with a firmness. These are a little bit more subjective and requires some interaction from the practitioner to decide what firmness, for example, means to them, which will be different than the person next to them. And then everyone is balancing relative to themselves, which is really helpful to move us toward this state of moksha, and also to move us toward this state of swastha from Ayurveda, because swastha in Ayurveda means, in Sanskrit, stability in the self, right? So when we're really making decisions for ourselves, for the greater good of ourselves and thus for other people, then we're both on the path of Ayurveda and yoga simultaneously. And we're using the strength of both of those sciences in completeness to support this goal, as opposed to using yoga to balance dosha, which doesn't really support yoga's goals and also is not really how Ayurveda is practiced either, because both are systemic practices. So by balancing guna regularly, also it allows us to engage with this experience of dosha prakopa, the increase of dosha in the body, because we're really getting to know the gunas, which are how doshas change. So by learning the gunas, it makes it a lot easier to experience the dosha and to become really nuanced with what they are and how they present themselves. Additionally, if we practice using and seeing and experiencing and choosing guna on the mat, where the stakes are kind of low, it makes it a lot easier for the practitioner to then put that into the rest of their life, thus changing their lifestyle. Because then you can start to pay attention to taste of food, time of eating, feeling of hunger, because by practicing yoga Ayurvedically, we become more in tune with our needs. And when we're more in tune with our true needs, as opposed to what's like kind of an addictive or habitual need, a yoga vritti or a chitta vritti from yoga, from the yoga darshan, like we end up making better choices overall, and then we end up taking yoga off the mat. So this is how Ayurvedic yoga can be supportive, and why I prefer practicing Ayurvedic yoga from the gunic perspective as opposed to from the doshic perspective. Because when we take yoga off the mat, or take Ayurveda off the yoga mat and put it back into the life, having practiced it on the yoga mat, practitioners will be able to think of food, of activity, of conversation, the same way they were thinking about how to move their foot, how to step forward, how to get to the back of the mat, how to lie down, what variation to take and why and how in detail, right? It'll be a lot easier to put that into the grosser life, the bigger life. So to me, this is why Ayurvedic yoga is really powerful and beautiful. And it's the one that's practiced with the highest goals of both philosophies, of both schools of science, kept in mind, and then used to support each other rather than like putting one on top of the other. So maintaining the highest goals of the practice allows for smaller supports, general ease in the body, general ease in the mind, which leads to greater comfort and activity and life in general, but also allows for this opportunity of really tangible transformation on a systemic level. So I look forward to having you in courses with me and in class. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.